Welcome to episode 97 of Kuyperian Commentary. I'm your host, Yuri Brito. As you may know by now, the world has gone mad. But the implication of Romans chapter 1 is that there is a consequential insanity that comes from allowing our fleshly desires to frame our reality. But insane times call for sane measures, and sane measures only come from a revelation that defines sanity as that which proceeds from the mouth of God. Our role here at Kuyperian has been to provide very sane material for over a decade. We are striving to propagate the gospel of sanity and also to offer our readers and listeners sane and lucid voices in our day. And our guest today is one of these lucid voices, not only on social media, but also in the, as Doug Wilson says, in the theology out of your fingertips kind of way. He has over 5,000 followers on Twitter. And I mentioned that only because there are those who put out material for the sake of adding words into the mathematic and calculation of Twitterdom. And then there are those who are really trying to shape the conversation with fruitful summaries of very big ideas. And Brian, I hope I get this correctly. Is it Brian Sauvé?
Sauvé, nailed
Sauvé.
it.
Okay, close enough. We have the, in Brazil, we have the accents also stressing that latter vowel there. Brian Sauvé, he is one of these sane voices, and I'm really delighted to have him on the show today. And he is a pastor in Ogden, Utah, and I'll let him share a little bit about that. But first and foremost, Brian, welcome to Kuyperian, brother.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It is a joy to be on and connect with you.
Yeah, delight to have you. Tell us a little bit about your current state right now, where you are, where you minister, and where you shepherd at this stage in history.
Yeah, so we are a medium-sized congregation down in Ogden and have been on quite a long and bumpy and tumultuous journey of reform over the last decade altogether. So we've probably been 4 different churches at various times, but
okay.
Semper Reformanda.
Amen.
And we are a just ragtag team of Reformed Catholics singing the Psalms together and aiming to really make Ogden a Christian city, see the temples turned into something better. I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Lord's been kind here in Utah, and we've got a lot of work before us, but never a dull moment.
Well, fantastic. Well, as the great philosopher Nacho Libre would say, everything you said is exactly what I believe. I'm really, really glad for that. That's a great introduction to our conversation here. I think, I have come across in the last 14, 15 years as a senior pastor of a congregation, a lot of voices that really are trying to add into the beauty of Christendom in the role of the church and society here. And I've really sort of followed you a little bit from afar, especially on Twitter. And I want to begin by talking just a little bit, Brian, about the role of social media in growing your vision for church life, and in some ways sort of developing a perspective of how Christians ought to engage the world, expressing our worldview. And the nature of Twitter, for example, I think obviously there's a lot of rationalization about the toxic nature of Twitter and other social media platforms. But I have found, and I'd love to hear your thoughts, I found it, and I still do find it fairly invigorating in order to communicate effectively to the world our understanding of reality and our little micro Christendom, as my friend Dustin Messer likes to say. So tell me a little bit, because I follow you on Twitter. Tell me how you go about the process of thinking through social media as a distinctly Christian platform, even though we know that the powers that be over Twitter and Facebook are antagonistic towards the kind of sanity that you and I propose. But tell me, walk me through a little bit of just how you think through this this wonderful tool, which I believe to be Twitter.
Yeah, man, when I think about pastoral ministry in general, and even just the Christian task in general of evangelizing and discipling and baptizing and instructing the nations to worship Christ, it's such a task that is related to words that it's hard for me to write off any platform that is mainly about words off the cuff, no matter who's in charge of it. If Christians can show up on that platform and deploy words as weapons and promote arguments. Paul says that we have spiritual power to destroy strongholds, but he immediately ties that in 2 Corinthians 10 to lofty opinions raised against the knowledge of God. So this is a verbal combat that's happening on many levels. And I found Twitter, Gab, Facebook, a lot of these platforms to be one of the more effective means of, on the one side, stealing my people against the tactics and onslaught of the enemy. And mainly, like you've been saying, just by saying sane things clearly and unapologetically, just sane words, sane biblical words that maybe 50 years ago, when the idols were differently arranged in the pantheon, wouldn't have caused much of a ruckus. But today, if you say sane things about precisely those areas where the demon gods of the age are attacking, or where people are, going astray in the church, I've found that tends to rally the troops on the side of my people and protect them from having their Overton window shifted and being pulled just inexorably and inevitably in that kind of Gramscian sort of way towards craziness, until pretty soon they look back and they realize they've been counter-discipled by false gods. And then on the other side, with the unbelieving world, I think that there is something to be said for going right into that place, the breach where the fight is happening, with those same sane words, and essentially just pointing right at that antithesis and saying, this is where we have a chasm between us. I'm not necessarily looking for an overlap where we can, agree on a few things and then maybe build some rapport. I'm more interested in the current discourse in dancing on the antithesis and waving a big flag, if that makes sense. Those are kind of the two main aims, at least when I'm approaching these platforms.
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic sort of synopsis of the whole Twitter scandal. I mean, I think the brouhaha that sort of envelops around these conversations, in some ways, may be a development of an outworking of the pietistic tendencies of evangelicals. If indeed our role is to internalize our faith in our religious expressions, then a platform such as Twitter, where ideas clash as a way of living, as a full-time job, is going to be somewhat fearful for a lot of these folks. And I think that's a really beneficial way of phrasing it, because I think dancing in the antithesis goes to the very heart of this conversation. I think we live in, I believe firmly actually, that we live in a time when being a Christian is actually very easy. Being a Christian of any sort, if you want to stand upon basic DNA of Christendom, we live in such a time. So if you felt in many ways that you didn't have the capacity to sort of express your Christian faith in any intelligent or intellectual way, well, now what I consider to be intellectual in the vocabulary and grammar of Christendom is simply making statements about sexuality that were commonplace 20, 30 years ago. And I think these statements necessarily is going to invoke a kind of antagonism towards your position. So that my argument has been, Brian, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, for quite some time, especially during the COVID hysteria, that the Christian man and the woman no longer can hide behind apathy and complacency. It's very easy now to detect in church life who is for Christendom, who is attempting to hide from Christendom, and those who are at the edge of falling away from Christendom. And any reaction to that? Just hear your thoughts.
Oh, yeah, that was fun within the church. I think that you could divide up the landscape of different cultures and in aims and goals around those lines pretty readily, where you have people that they don't like conflict, they don't want sparks, they don't like this. They're always saying they'll try to reduce someone maybe like you or I to culture warriors. Stop just culture warring. Don't you understand? It's about the spiritual kingdom. It's about the gospel. And I think that what maybe the aim there is to sort of carve out a space where we can live our spiritual kingdom and avoid as many, you know, conflict points with the other team as possible. And I think a lot of those people are convinced that that's an effective strategy for evangelism, and kind of we're always going to be this harried minority sort of position. But the minute you start actually taking the text of scripture and just plainly, straightforwardly, and not in like a theological PhD sort of way,
Right.
but just on a blue collar level, saying,
Right.
here's what the text says. Here's the kind of culture that ought to result in the church from this text. And in the world we live in right now, that's a radical statement. It's a declaration of war on the
Right.
level of what it means to be a human. What is a boy? What is a girl? What is sexuality? What are the basic aims for living of, Christ shows us that he comes to, I think, renovate every aspect of what it means to be human. And so, I think that those two camps could easily, sort of capture the majority of the different flavors of different teams or visions for the Christian life in the world. And those certainly show up in stark contrast on social media platforms where everything's distilled down to a paragraph and a word.
Yeah. I was thinking as you were speaking that the concern that some people have is that we're being pugilists for the sake of pugilism, but we're attempting to be Pauline, really. So when Paul says that we are to live a quiet and peaceable life in 1 Timothy chapter 2, this is in the context of Paul being highly confrontational and edifying to Timothy. Timothy has a tremendous duty to protect his flock. And so it's important that we understand a quiet and peaceable life doesn't mean simply, sort of accepting window bearing into your heart. There's an entirely new ethos that Paul is sort of attempting to convey here. And I think that's crucial. So what we need to make it clear that what we're not asking is that our people, endeavor in the 2:00 warfare on Facebook or Twitter. We want them to get a good night's rest. We want fathers and mothers to love each other, sleep in the same bed, and all of that. But I think, as you mentioned, you can't stay away from the fight. You are inevitably in it. And the reason you are is because you decide to come to worship on Sundays. At the moment you walk into those doors, you are walking into a decisively war mentality, whether you know it or not, in the way you sing, in the way you confess, in the way you hear, in the way you profess, and all these things. And so it's crucial to keep these things in mind. We are in a warfare mode, and it's a warfare mode that is going to carry us to a trajectory. And as a congregation, as pastors, we are leading our people in a particular trajectory. And we're trying to equip them to do what Nehemiah says is, I think he says that on the one hand, they're carrying on their labors, and on the other hand, they have a sword. And so there is this dynamic taking place where you are continuing to live a quiet and peaceful life by doing what you're called to do. And at the same time, you're fighting against principalities and powers and destroying every lofty argument that comes against the lordship of Jesus. Any follow-ups there? I have one more thought on that issue there, but go ahead. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, really briefly, what I think that is the decisive framing of the battle. When we come to worship, we're coming to remember and renew the covenant of our salvation. And when you understand the nature of that covenant that we're calling on God to fulfill and worshiping him in light of, that's a covenant that includes the absolute claiming of all things under Christ's feet. It's a covenant that includes the bringing in all of his sheep from every fold, all of the families of the earth, Psalm 22. I mean, when you understand what you're doing in corporate worship and what you're calling on God to do and worshiping him in light of, it shows us that on the one hand, our lives they're mundane in a sense, because we're doing lots of little, small, slow yeast-like things to obey the Lord in our everyday vocation. But it's also spectacular because we're actually participating in the outworking of this glorious world saving, world transforming, world renewing covenant. And I think, keeping both of those in mind helps you, on the one hand, not be just, a crazy Facebook warrior, all doing nothing really, not embracing the good, glorious mundanities, but also even in those mundanities, the wife doing laundry, she needs to understand she is participating in something spectacular by obeying the Lord in that work, outflowing from the worship from the people of God. So yeah, that was what you said really helped me think about that for in a new way. I think that's really good.
Well, thanks for that. That's a very good word, Brian. I want to you want to instruct your congregation. You want to let them know that this is a larger argument, I think, for what we would consider theological complementarianism, which can be and it cannot be a helpful word. It has a sort of but I think you're looking at a male priesthood essentially leading the congregation. If the people understand that we as men are going for that one of that lovely songs that my friend Greg Wilbur put into tune, "The Son of God goes forth to war." If you understand that the pastor, the male pastor, is leading the congregation into war as he's leading the congregation in worship, therefore you know that you are participating in something much greater. But the question really is, how far will you be from the pastor? How close will you be to him? If you're leading faithfully, there will be some of the congregation who will say, "I'm right behind you." And if you're the precipice about to fall away from Christendom, you're going to try to be 3-4 miles behind. You want to be away from the warfare. And I think our role in some ways in edifying the saints, fulfilling that sort of imperative the Apostle Paul is to bring them closer to the front lines. Mm-hmm. And anyway, one follow-up, because I think this is I have many love languages apart from chicken wings. One of my love languages is brevity. I love brevity. I am a fan of Twitter in many ways because of that. I think when Christians say you can't theologize on Twitter, I say you're wrong. And then I respond with fewer characters just to irritate them. But I think this is part of the conversation here, because I think brevity has the ability to sort of communicate these things. Every time I do an interview, when I'm interviewed by I don't know, radio station or some kind of podcast, I sort of prepare a few lines that I think are going to be detectable by an audience, because I think we have in some ways failed the test by embracing sort of Puritan rituals of sermonizing, which nothing, part of my dissertation was on the Puritans, so nothing against Puritanism per se, but methodologically, I think it can be it can endanger our message when you lose your people with so many details. I wanted to hear your thoughts on Twitter and how the role of brevity, if any, plays in the way you think about your arguments and just your presentation overall.
Yeah, brother, I have 36 points that I'd like to share on that. No. I tell our guildsmen, our pastoral training program guys all the time, hey, a sermon or communication in general is usually improved the same way that the sword is sharpened, by removing material. Right?
Exactly.
So,
I like that.
When you think about some of the most efficient ways to communicate, you're gonna land on things like a sign or a symbol that in one little snapshot can communicate volumes, and it can have depth. And just because it's a small thing, it doesn't mean that it lacks richness or, a multifaceted communication underneath it. And when I think about some of the best communicators that I would want to imitate, they know how to deploy lengthy, detailed, complex ideas, but they also know how to communicate those same ideas in a very brief space of time. And Twitter is such a good discipline for that. It just helps you. It helps you see, I don't actually understand this yet because I can't communicate it in however many characters they give us these days. And that's a test to me. Can I communicate this idea in 3 sentences in a way that would spur thought for someone who is, a thoughtful theologian of men, among men, and someone in my congregation that's never thought about this topic before. And I really, I appreciate that limitation. I think it's very helpful.
Yeah, it is very fruitful, and I think it could cover a multitude of homiletical sins if that was sort of kept close, because I think we have bought into the idea that one of my old professors from RTS, Richard Pratt, he would always say that you can't say everything, because when you attempt to say everything, you say nothing at all. And I think there's a neat sort of approach to this subject here when you think of brevity overall as a hermeneutical tool to help the pastor and to help our public presence, right? That it is more fruitful, in my estimation, to in some ways lead people to asking more questions than assume that you have said the last word. So if I have a conversation on Facebook where I probably have more people reading my material, and I begin to, when I write, I begin to get a host of private messages saying, "Hey, can you elaborate on this?" I'm like, "I got you.
Yeah.
I got you where you need to be." And I think Twitter sort of functions in that same way. Well, let's talk about something that you and I share in common. Here in Pensacola, Florida, our congregation is sort of known as the Singing Church, and it's a badge of honor that I carry around here. And part of the desire is not so much that we establish a choir-like presence in Pensacola, Florida, even though I always tell my congregation that when I'm preaching, I'm literally preaching to the choir, and I think that's a good way of approaching it. But when you're thinking about music in general, my mind immediately goes to the famous Zephaniah passage in chapter 3, that God exalts over us with singing, and that God himself is our great song leader, and that we are put into, as my old Sunday school teacher, I don't know if you had a chance to meet him or listen to his material, James Jordan, who he and I spent 3 years together. He would always say that God created the world through music, that the world is Vern Poythress would say, a symphonic world. And God is putting these pieces together, and you understand it better when music is part of your repertoire, when music is part of your meal, and if the church life sort of embodies this musical way of looking at the world, then they're going to realize that God is not only a God who makes propositions and imperatives, but he, to use the word that some people are not comfortable with, but he also puts us into a particular dance in this world, and we are the ones who are to set the mood of the dance. If we let pietistic evangelicals, of which I was one and I have great love for, but if we let them lead the way, we know what that produces. But if we sort of establish a principle of joy and feasting and enjoying the presence of one another, then the world will see what Nietzsche couldn't see in Christians, that Christians are to be known for the joy they have in their lives. Anyway, general thoughts on that. That's sort of my outline when I think through these issues. I always think of the Zephaniah 3 passage.
Well, I wanted to play an organ underneath you while you were preaching that. Man, I just think it's fantastic that God commanded all Christians to sing. I just think that's fantastic that he's giving us all of these things to do when we come together to worship him. And then multiple times, even in the New Testament, he's sing to one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, making melody in your hearts. That whole command there is, I think, an assault on the shallow and trite and the taker culture that we have today, that just wants to consume something easy, something that takes no effort in things like music even, and therefore never learns how to join in the deeper glory of actually producing something together, beauty together. And there is a glory that is, in my opinion, unrivaled in the world. And it's the glory of a congregation that knows how to sing. Not a congregation that has a great choir or a congregation that has some great musicians in it, but a congregation that can come together. And whether there's a single instrument in the room and they're just at a dinner table gathered somewhere, or they're out at the park, or they're in their gathered worship on the Lord's Day, that they have clearly been a people who have they've thrown themselves into learning this skill of singing beautifully together. And I think that just says something about, to the sparse sort of pragmatic type of, you have this, I think of an archetypal person who's like the sparse pragmatist who just, what does it do? Give me the propositions.
Yeah.
And to that person, God says, yeah, but can you sing a fugue?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that's so glorious. That just says something about the nature of God and the richness of God. And it's just, there's not another place in culture anymore that you can go where you can find that, a musical people, a singing people. And so, man, that's goals. That's what I hope that our congregation in Ogden is someday known as. They're the singing people.
Yeah. Yeah.
They're the people that they can belt out some glorious tunes together when they gather.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think the additional point that just comes to mind is that it is hard to be a silent voice in that congregation that treasures singing, because you stand out. I mean, as I'm looking, one of my habits here in my congregation, because I've been here for a long time and I have the white hair to prove it, is I look at my young men in my flock, and after the service, I will usually go to one or two, because, as you know, pastors can see everything, and I will go to them and say, so were you, I noticed you were silent in verses 3, 4, and 5. Is something wrong with your voice? Are you sick?
Yeah.
Anything I can do for you? Should I anoint you? If you don't have any problems, your duty should have been singing. And so I've made it a quest of mine to encourage men in particular to sing, because if they do lead in that regard, the family will follow. And that has been, I think, very crucial in developing the singing culture we have here in Pensacola. But I think it'll also be crucial as we move forward as Christian pastors in attempting to sort of revive an art that has been dormant for a very long time. We have, in some ways, this is not necessarily wrong, but we have elevated the sermonic over the singing, and sermons ought to be a form of singing unto the Lord as well. There's one section in Ephesians, and I think in Colossians as well, where the Apostle Paul says, singing of psalms and hymns and spirit songs, which comes in many ways in the middle of a counseling text. And if you think of music beyond merely, beyond merely pronouncing high, beautiful theological word, but if you think of music as a ministry to your neighbor, it would be a relative disservice you would do to your neighbor when you keep your voice silent. It's as if you're practically saying, I have no interest in ministering to you. And that should be certainly a part of the Christian experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That sing to one another. We almost every week in the liturgy, I'm trying to remind our people of what our singing is for and who it's aimed at. And we're singing to the Lord, and we're singing to each other. When you sing all hail the power of Jesus' name, you're telling your neighbor to do that at the same time as you're declaring the glory of God to God. And you're right. When you have people that shrink back from that, and they say, well, I'm not really musical, I'm not really whatever. Well, sorry, it's a command. And so the Lord made you to do, you can do this. But I think that it also, the lack of this culture really does fall to the leading class of the church, to the pastors, that so many pastors have sort of exported the singing to a professional class, religious professionals, especially dispensing spiritual goods and service to the congregation. And it's making musical context where it's easy to hide and receive and then fundamentally you're being lied to about what the singing even is for and is supposed to be. So one of the greatest glories for our congregation has been transitioning over the last few years to music that is vocally forward, music where the rule is, if you need the instrument to sing this song, it's probably not good enough for us. The song needs to be, and in the experience of it, we ought to have the way that we amplify and support the singing, such that you still can't hide. That the congregation should be able to know as they walk away from a song, like, wow, we don't know that one well enough yet. We really need to practice that one, because it was lame, or encouraged by, wow, we just produced that.
Yeah.
Together. That wasn't some guy on a stage, or some musicians up there, professionals. That was us that did. It should be obvious one way or the other, even just so the congregation learns. Like, I actually have to put effort into this. I have to learn. I have to put my heart into this and my soul into this, because it's a skill that you have to learn from the ground up. But it truly is approachable to every Christian can join in this choir. I mean, this is not an elitist sort of thing. Every Christian can do it.
Right. There's an irony to the whole process too, because as we speak as, good Protestants, in one of our war, especially Luther's war against the church of the day, was that it was a church that was producing a kind of elitist musicianship. And he addresses this a lot in his table talk, and producing a musicianship that did not incorporate the people. And of course, Calvin and Luther fought against that. Calvin introduced Psalms and all of that. And we, in the Protestant world, especially the broad evangelical world, we despise Catholicism. We have a Catholic phobia. And we are actually doing the exact same thing that the Protestants protested, which is, in evangelical churches, they're creating this elite musicianship. And you can only be a part of it if you have particular skills, musician skills, instrumental skills. And we are content in allowing them to lead that as the quote professionals, and the people can just sit back and sort of hum their way through it, because in many ways, sometimes the professionals have microphones, of course, which they're always going to overwhelm the congregational voice. Anyway, I've always found that intriguing, to say the least, that our Catholic phobia, we fall for the very same thing that we criticize.
Yep. We just do it with dotted eighth delays on electric guitars and vibey keyboard pads.
Exactly.
Instead of chants in Latin that people can't understand. Yep. It's the same thing.
Yeah, no, I agree. All right, so before I let you go, let's talk about these rumors out there that you got a music CD that just came out recently. Talk about that.
Yeah, I've been, from the early stages of our church, aiming to recover this singing culture. We realized pretty quickly that we needed a bridge to get us from what we were doing, a lot of contemporary stuff done contemporarily, to singing psalms, figuring out how to do that, whole psalms, and making the singing the main event, rather than the stuff happening on the stage. And I was looking for resources, had a hard time finding resources in that vein. And so I said, okay, I'm going to try to make a few resources that can bridge a congregation like ours into this glorious, rich tradition, to where they can end up someday holding a psalter or a hymnal, singing from it in 4 parts. The men can sing, the women can sing, everybody can participate. And so I've slowly been walking through that stylistic journey in the music that I've been making, until this one is the most metrical and easily adaptable to a piano and parts singing. And I hope to adapt it to that in our own congregation first, and then maybe put that out. But that was the basic goal. And then as a side benefit, giving our people something that when they're doing dishes at home or when they're driving to work, they can be listening to the Psalms and memorizing them without even trying. And so this one is called this is my first full-length album that just came out this week. It's called Sing Psalms, Let Joy Resound, which is a call to Psalm 98 in the Book of Psalms for Singing 73. And I do a little guitar version of it on the album of that one. And the rest are original settings of most 10 metrical psalms, and then Kyrie eleison and Gloria Patri as well. So hoping that it serves a lot of, my wife jokes that it is the soundtrack for reformed moms, because that's where most of the plays are happening. But also my sneaky goal is that it would just convince, like you said, men to, with confidence, sing the Psalms loud, be able to, and And it's funny because our congregation that we're now ahead of the bridge. So
Yeah.
we're now singing from a Psalter and a hymnal, and we don't do my songs on Sunday, which I'm very pleased about, actually.
Yeah.
But I hope it serves I know there are a lot of churches, a lot of pastors out there that maybe aren't musical, and they need to be able to give their worship guy something and say, hey, I want to do some Psalms. Can we do some of these? And I'm hoping that works.
Well, that's fantastic, because I think there is this is a long-term strategy, right? So we're building incrementally on certain things, and I don't think churches should go from Fanny Crosby to Schultz overnight.
Yeah. Oh,
you will lose everybody.
yeah.
But there ought to be a happy direction and guidance as you move towards certain goal. It's a long-term strategy. I encourage pastors very often to build on these habits and start in the the beautiful tunes and the familiar ones, and move up. In other words, give them an appetite and a hunger for these things, to the point where they will be asking you, not you asking them. That's the ultimate ideal, for sure. Well, a lot of moms do ask me, hey, what can I listen to, Pastor, on Spotify? Brian Sauvé has a new CD. Is that on Spotify already?
Spotify, Apple Music, iTunes, YouTube, all these things I don't even know of. I put it up on my distributor and say, send it. I hear it's even on Snapchat, I think.
Sweet. How about that?
Talk about going into the dark places of the world.
Yeah, no kidding. No kidding. That is a dark place. I'm very glad your music is there, shedding a little light on that place there. Well, good. Brian Sauvé, good to meet you, brother. Good to spend some time with you and talking about your passions and desires to move your church to greater holiness, and to be able to be a faithful congregation singing songs to our triune God. Delight to have you in KC, my brother.
Thank you. It was great finally getting to see you at least on a screen in person.
Yes, we will make that journey one day, and enjoy a good bowl of tobacco. Lord bless you.
Sure. Lord bless you.